You're worthless trash, Samuel. My daughter deserves better. My name is Samuel Hayes, and I'm 37 years old. I've spent the last 12 years building a private equity firm in Denver, Colorado, making investments that most people never see coming. Through shell companies and mouse trusts, holding firms that keep my name buried in paperwork so deep that even the smartest lawyers take months to trace it back to me. That's how I lick it. Clean, invisible, powerful. But right now, standing in my kitchen, watching him wave his coffee mug around like he's conducting an orchestra of insults, I felt anything but powerful. Robert Kellerman had been calling me worthless for 3 years straight. Every family dinner, every holiday, every time I walked through his front door. She could have married Dr. Patterson's son, he continued, gesturing toward my wife, Elena, but no, she picked you. A man won't even tell us what he really does for a living. Elena sat at the breakfast table, stirring her eggs around her plate. She never looked up, never said a word, just kept stirring those damn eggs like they held the answer to everything wrong with our marriage. Samuel works in finance, Dad. She finally mumbled, still not meeting my eyes. Finance, Robert scoffed. You know what that means? Nothing. Could be selling insurance for all we know. Could be managing other people's retirement accounts at some strip mall office. I watched him pace around his Granatecachin Island, his face getting redder with each lap. This was Robert Kellerman, founder and chief executive officer of Nexira Labs, a struggling biotech company that hadn't turned aerial profit in 4 years. He had inherited money from his father's construction business and thought that made him some kind of financial genius. What Robert didn't know was that I'd been tracking his company's financial statements for 8 months. Nexira Labs was hemorrhaging cash, burning through what little venture funding they had left. They needed a miracle. They needed exactly the kind of anonymous investor that is specialized in being. You sit there like a mute, Robert said, pointing his finger at my chest. Real men speak up. Real men defend themselves. I nodded slowly. You're right, Mr. Kellerman. The kitchen went quiet. Elena finally looked up from her plate, confusion written across her face. Even Robert seemed surprised by my response. I am right, he said, his voice Absolutely, I said, standing, opened, reaching for my jacket. Elena does deserve better. I walked toward their front door, feeling their eyes on my back. As I reached for the handle, I heard Elena's chair scrape against Thefla. Samuel, wait. But I was already outside, breathing the cold November air, knowing that everything was about to change. I met Elena 5 years ago at a conference in Boulder. She was presenting research on gene therapy applications, brilliant and passionate about her work at a small biotech firm. I was there because I'd been considering advance in the medical technology sector. What I didn't expect was to fall for the presenter. Our relationship moved fast, too fast probably. Within 18 months, we were married in a small ceremony the father complained about 4 weeks. He wanted something bigger, more expensive, something that would impress us country club friends. But Elena Andy preferred simple things, or so I thought. The problem started during our first Christmas as a married couple. Robert had too much wine and began interrogating me about my work. I gave him the same vague answers I give every own. Private investments, portfolio management, consulting for high net worth individuals. All technically true, but missing the crucial detail that I was the high net worth individual. My company, Ventures, managed over $200 million in assets. We specialized in early stage investments in technology and medical companies. Second, of deals that required discretion and anonymity. I'd built my reputation by staying invisible, letting other people take credit while I quietly collected returns that most investors could only dream about. But Robert interpreted my discretion as weakness. He started making comments about my mystery job and how a real man would be more transparent about his career. Alina would change these objects or laugh it off, but she never told him to stop, never stood up for me. The verbal attacks escalated over the following months. Robert would make snide remarks about my clothes, my car, my lack of ambition. He'd compare me to their men in their social circle, successful doctors and lawyers who drove cars and talked loudly about their achievements. What made it worse was watching Alina shrink during Dessa confrontations. The confident scientist he'd married became quiet and apologetic, constantly making excuses for her father's behavior. She'd pull me as a defter, particularly brutal dinners, and whisper apologies, promising it would get better. But she never confronted him directly. 3 months ago, I discovered something that changed everything. The company was in serious trouble, burning through cash faster than they could raise it. They'd approached dozens of venture capital firms, but their debt to revenue ratio scared away most serious investors. That's when I realized I had a choice, Tomek. I could help save Robert's company through an anonymous investment, or he could let it fail. The businessman in May saw the potential upside. The son-in-law, me, saw something else entirely. He started the due diligence process, keeping my identity buried behind layers of corporate structure. Robert would never know that his salvation was sitting at his dinner table, listening to his insults, watching his daughter stay silent. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during Elena's birthday dinner. We were at Robert's house, and he'd invited his brother-in-law, Harold, a cardiac surgeon who loved talking about his vacation home in Aspen. Harold just bought a new boat, Robert announced as Alina cut her cake. 40-feet yacht cost him more than most people make in 5 years. Harold laughed and clapped me on the shoulder. What about you, Samuel? Any big purchases lately? New car, investment property. I should have seen it coming. Robert's eyes lit up with that familiar gleam that meant he was about to go in for the kill. Samuel doesn't make those kinds of purchases, Robert said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. He's more of a practical man, aren't you, Samuel? Ilanina squeezed my hand under the table, a warning to stay calm. But Robert wasn't finished. I mean, let's be honest here. My daughter is a brilliant scientist. She's published in major journals, speaks at international concern. She could have marry a Donyan, a doctor, a lawyer, someone with real prospects. Instead, she settled for, he gestured vaguely in mid-erection. Well, we all make mistakes. The room went silent. Elena's hand went limp in mine. Harold stared at his cake like it was the most fascinating thing ever seen, and Robert sat there with a satisfied smile, waiting for my reaction. I looked at Alina, really looked at her. She was staring at her lap, her face flushed with embarrassment. Not embarrassment for her father's behavior, but embarrassment for being married to someone her father considered beneath her. That's when I understood this wasn't going to get better. Alina wasn't going to stand up for me because deep down she agreed with him. Maybe not completely, but now to stay silent enough to let him tear me down in front of her family. I stood up, slowly placed my napkin on the table, and looked directly at Robert. You're absolutely right, I said. Shidos deserve better. I kissed Alina on the forehead, grabbed my coat, and walked out. Behind me, I heard Eleanor calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I had work to do. The drive home gave me time to think. For months, I'd been preparing investment documents for Nexora Labs, a $15 million funding pack that would save Robert's companion secure his retirement. The paperwork was ready. All it needed was my signature. I pulled into my driveway, sat in the car for 10 minutes, and made a decision. I wasn't going to sign those documents. In fact, I was going to do something much more satisfying. I was going to let Robert Kellerman learn exactly what it felt like to need Simeon he considered worthless. The next morning, I called my lawyer, James Morrison, and asked him to draft 3 documents. A formal withdrawal of investment interest in Nexora Labs, a notice of contract termination for the pending funding agreement, and a confidentiality release that would allow him to reveal my identity as the anonymous investor. "Are you sure about this, Samuel?" James asked during our meeting. "You've spent months on the due diligence. The investment fundamentals are sound despite the family politics, I'm sure." I said sometimes the best investment is the one you don't make. By noon, I had everything I needed. James would deliver the withdrawal notice to Nexora Labs at exactly 10 a.m. the following morning. I wanted Robert to have a full day to panic before he understood what had happened. The evening, Elena came home around 8 p.m. She'd been staying at her sister's house since the birthday dinner, and he could tell from her posture that she'd been crying. "We need to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from me in our living room. "Okay, my dad called me today. He's worried Fath went too far the other night. He almost laughed, worried. He wants to apologize. Maybe we could have dinner this weekend, just the 3 of us. Start over." I studied her face, looking for any sign that she understood what had really happened. But Alina was still thinking this was about hurt feelings and wounded pride. She had no idea that her father had just insulted the one person who could save his company. "Alina," I said carefully, "how long have you been ashamed of me?" The question caught her off guard. "What? I'm not ashamed. You've never once told your father to stop insulting me." "Stop insulting me? Not once in 3 years. He doesn't mean it. He's just protective. He called me worthless trash in front of your entire family. You said nothing." Elena's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know what to say. "He gets hungry when people confront him, so you chose his comfort over my dignity. That's not fair," but it was fair, and Webeth knew it. Alina had made her choice long ago. Every time she stayed silent, every time she made excuses for his behavior, she was choosing her father over her husband. "I love you," she said, which somehow made it worse. "I know you do. But love isn't enough when you won't fight for it." She left. An hour later, and I knew she wouldn't be coming back. Not really. Even if we stayed married, even if we went to counseling and worked through our problems, there would always be a part of her that saw me through, her father says. The next morning, I woke up early and drove to my office. At exactly 10 a.m., I called James to confirm that the withdrawal notice had been delivered to Nexora Labs. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. "Samuel." Elena's voice was shaky. "Something's happened. Dad's company just lost their major investor, $15 million. He's completely falling apart." "I'm sorry to hear that." "The lawyers won't tell him who pulled out. They said it was an anonymous investment group, but no, they're claiming breach of confidentiality terms. Dad's talking about bankruptcy." I stayed quiet, listening to her breathing on the other end of the line. Samuel, I know you work in finance. Do you think could you maybe ask around? See if anyone knows anything about this investment group. The irony was almost too perfect. She was asking me to help find the investor who could save her father, not knowing that she was talking to him. I'll see what I can do, I said. After I hung up, I drafted 2 text messages and scheduled them to be sent following morning. The first would go to Alina. The second would go to Robert. Both would arrive at exactly 10 a.m. along with a third. Message from James Morrison: by tomorrow afternoon, everyone would know exactly who they'd been dealing with. That evening, I went through the Nexor Labs files one more time. What I found confirmed everything I'd suspected about Robert Kellerman's business acumen. The company had been hemorrhaging money for 18 months, ever since a failed product launched that Robert had insisted on pushing through despite warnings from his research team. He'd overruled his own scientists, convinced that his business is superior to their technical expertise. The resulting disaster had cost Nexira Labs their partnership with 2 major pharmaceutical companies and nearly $3 million in development costs. But instead of accepting responsibility, Robert had blamed the research team, fired 3 senior scientists, and started shopping for new investors to bail him out. What made it worse was that Alina had been one of the scientists who'd opposed the launch. She'd written a detailed memo explaining the product wasn't ready for market. But Robert had dismissed her concerns as typical overcaution from academic. When the launch failed exactly as she'd predicted, he'd made her life so miserable that she'd eventually quit and found work at our smaller firm. Alina had never told Meth full story. She'd mentioned Thatched had some disagreements with her father about research priorities. Butched framed it as a difference of opinion rather than what it really was. Robert's arrogance destroying judgment. I called Alina's former colleague, Dr. Patricia Webb, who'd left Nexor Labs around the summertime as Alina. Patricia and I had met at several industry conferences, and she'd always been candid about the challenge Seth working in biotech. Patricia, this is Samuel Hayes, Eleanor. I hope you don't mind me calling Samuel. Of course not. How's Alina doing? She's fine. I'm actually calling about something else. I'm researching Nexira Labs for a potential investment, and I wanted to get your perspective on their research capabilities. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Samuel, can I speak freely, please? Robert Kellerman is a disaster. Brilliant scientists, solid research foundation, but the man has no business running a biotech company. He treats his research staff like factory workers and makes decisions based on ego rather than data. Can you give me an example? The Neurotrapan launch. We had 6 months off testing data showing the compound wasn't stable enough for clinical trials. Eleanor wrote a 20-page analysis explaining exactly why it would fail. Robert ignored it, pushed the launch forward, and lost the company nearly $3 million. The FDA rejected the application. What happened to Alina after that? Robert blamed her for the failure. Said she was being negative and uncommitted her, the company's success made her work environment so toxic that she had to leave. Honestly, it broke my heart. Alina is one of the most talented researchers I've ever worked with. After I hung up, I sat in my office nearly midnight, thinking about everything Patricia had told me. Robert hadn't just insulted me at family dinner. He'd destroyed Elena's career because she'd had the courage to tell him the truth about his bad decisions. The $15 million investment I'd been preparing wasn't just going to save his company, it was going to reward him for years of arrogance and poor judgment. It was going to validate his belief that he was always right, even when he was catastrophically wrong. More importantly, it would mean that Eleanor would never have to choose between her father and her husband. She could keep both relationships intact, never confronting the fact that she'd stayed silent while he tore me down. But Nosh was going to have to choose. And based on everything I'd learned about Trober Kellerman, I had a feeling I knew which choice she'd make. The next morning, I arrived at my office early and made one final review of the withdrawal documents. Everything was in order. James would deliver the formal termination notice to Nexora Labs at 10 a.m. at the same time. Misscheduled text messages would be sent to Alina and Robert. At 9:45 a.m., I called Elena. "Samuel, is everything okay? I need to tell you something important, but I want you to sit down first. You're scaring me, Alina. I'm the anonymous Sinster who pulled out of Nexa Labs." Silence, complete silence for nearly 30 seconds. "What? My company, Amberlin Ventures, was prepared to invest $15 million in your father's biotech firm. I withdrew the offer yesterday morning. That's impossible. You work in portfolio management. You don't have $15 million. Alina, I own Amberlin Ventures. We manage over $200 million in assets. Evie Bean, the anonymous investor your father's been courting for 8 months." He could hear her breathing fast. "Angelo, this is some kind of joke. Check your phone. You're going to receive a text message in exactly 12 minutes. So is your father. The message will be from me confirming everything he just told you." "Samuel, this doesn't make sense. If you have that kind of money, why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't you to know. And because I wanted to see how your family would treat Simeon, they thought was beneath them. So this is what, some kind of test?" "No, it was going to be an investment write-up until your father called me worthless trash. In front of your entire family, and you said nothing." Alina started crying. "I should have defended you. I know that. But Samuel, this is my father's life, his company. You can't destroy it because your feelings got hurt." "This isn't about my feelings, Alina. It's about respect and consequences. Please, don't do this. We can fix things. I'll talk to him. I'll make him apologize. It's too late for apologies." At exactly 10 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text confirmation that both messages had been delivered. Eleanor's phone buzzed at the same time. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Samuel, please, I'm begging. You, don't destroy my father." "I'm not destroying him, Alina. I'm letting him face the consequences of his own choices. This is cruel. What's cruel is watching your husband get torn down for 3 years sand, never saying a word to stop it." Alina hung up. 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. This time, it was Robert and was screaming before I even said hello. "You son of a, you think this is funny. You think you can destroy me company because I hurt your feelings. Mr. Kellerman, I think you've the situation. I've misunderstood nothing." Alina told everything. "You're the investor. You're the one who pulled out. That's 23 people work for me, Samuel. 23 families depend on this company. You're willing to destroy all of them, Beckers. I said some things you didn't like. Actually, Mr. Kellerman, I'm willing to let your company succeed or fail based on its own merits without Mimini propping it up. We had a deal. We had a preliminary agreement that I'd chosen not to sign. No laws were broken. No contracts were violated." Robert was quiet for a moment, and when spoke again, his voice was different, smaller. "What do you want?" "Nothing, Mr. Doc Kellerman. I don't want anything from you. There has to be something. Money, an apology. What?" I want you to understand what it feels like to need someone you consider worthless. I hung up and turned off my phone. It was over. 3 days later, Alina filed for divorce. She came to the house while I was at work and packed her things, leaving only a letter on the kitchen counter. The letter was 2 pages long, but it boiled down to one simple message. She couldn't be married to Azamian, who would deliberately hurt her family. What she didn't mention was Thatched also cut off all contact with her father. I found out from Patricia Webb, who'd heard it from another former Nexora Labs employee. Alina had confronted Robert about how he treated me, and when he tried to justify his behavior, she told him exactly what Chef taught about his business decisions, his treatment of his research staff, and his years of verbal abuse. According to the conversation had ended with Alina telling her father that he destroyed her marriage and her career and that she never wanted to see him again. Robert had called her 17 times since then. She hadn't answered once. Within a week, news of Nexara Labs' financial troubles had spread through the biotech community. 2 more potential investors pulled out. Could be the company's debt ratio and the sudden departure of their lead funding source. Robert was forced to lay off 8 employees and close his secondary research facility. The local business journal ran a story about the company's struggles, focusing on the mysterious withdrawal of their primary investor. Robert refused to comment, but the article quoted several former employees who painted a picture of a company with leadership issues and poor strategic decisions. By the end of the month, Robert had put his house on the market and was liquidating his personal investments to keep the company afloat. The country club membership was gone. The vacation home in Vale was gone. Everything was being sold to buy time. I drove past his house one afternoon and saw him in the front yard pulling weeds from a garden that his landscaping service used to maintain. He looked older, smaller somehow, like Ammon who'd finally run out of other people to blame. 6 months later, he received word that Nexera Labs had declared bankruptcy. Robert had managed to find a buyer for some of their research assets, but the company itself was finished. The remaining employees were either laid off or absorbed by the acquiring firm. Robert himself had taken a job as a consultant for a company, working out of a Smallifus in a strip mall near the airport. The man who'd spent years lecturing me about success and achievement was now commuting to the kind of anonymous space he'd once mocked. Lenina never reached out to me directly, but I heard through mutual friends that she'd taken a position with the Research Institute in California. She was doing well, publishing papers and speaking at conferences again. She would found her voice in science, even if she would never found it in our marriage. He sold the house in Denver and moved to Portland, where I opened a new office for Ramblin' Ventures. The change of scenery was good for me, and the Pacific Northwest had a thriving tech community that offered plenty of investment opportunities. I never heard from Robert again, but I'd need to. The business journal skipped me updated on his decline. Every failed venture, every missed opportunity, every time someone chosen not to invest in his projects because of his reputation for poor decision-making, Robert Kellerman had learned what it meant to be dismissed, ignored, and considered worthless by people who held his future in their hands. He discovered that respect wasn't something you could demand or inherit. It was something you earned through how you treated others, especially when you thought they couldn't fight back. Sometimes, the best revenge is simply letting someone face the natural consequences of their own character. And sometimes, the most worthless person in the room turns out to be the one with all the power.